How did life start? Well, as I had previously mentioned, uh, it was once thought that life was constantly arising from the non-living world. That if one asked the question, where do these bugs come from? Where do these fish come from? Where do these tadpoles come from? That the majority of people on Earth would have believed that, oh, that, you just take water and you add sunlight, and just one of the natural characteristics of water is to give rise to these little critters. One of the characteristics of mud is once it's exposed to sunlight, that tadpoles or little frogs might pop out. That you expose garbage to air, and then just a natural reaction is for fly larvae to appear. That sawdust in your barn, once you add water, could give rise to mice. That was just what everyone thought, not just a poor farmer who had no chance to pursue an education, but the most educated and the most brilliant minds of the day. Spontaneous generation was just what was commonly held. Once the microscope was invented, it soon followed that all of these little critters were arising from previous little critters, that living things were giving rise to living things. It was not the case that it was dirt and mud and wet sawdust and garbage which was giving rise to this. And so then it became evident that living things were not spontaneously coming from the non-living world all around us, which then begs the question, if the living things of today came from parents who came from parents who came from parents who came from parents, where did the first living things come from? What was the origin of life? And once again, people could talk about, life started this way, but given that everyone pretty much held the idea of spontaneous generation, it wasn't as pressing an issue. Where did life come from? Because life was constantly arising from the non-living world all around us. As we look at the fossil record, there are certainly many types of living things alive today. And as we dig in the rocks of the world, you could find potentially trees everywhere throughout all of the rocks. So if you go back to the history of, say, the world, if trees have always existed, you could find evidence of trees. They're big, they have hard parts, they could be preserved. Corals have hard parts, and reefs can stretch for miles, if not hundreds of miles. So you could find coral reefs, you could find clamshells, you could find bones, you could find exoskeletons of arthropods. So if living things have always existed, if they go back to the beginning of the history of our planet, you could find evidence of them, because living things can be big, they can have hard parts, living things can be preserved. But if you were to ask, let's take the groups of life, how are they distributed in the history of Earth? One observes that first, the plants and the animals, they're only in the most recent time periods. So you do not find coral reefs all throughout the history of the world. You do not find forests. You simply don't. All right, there are just no Precambrian forests or coral reefs or mollusk shells, etc. So then if one goes back further, there's a period where you do have animals, but only simple animals, no vertebrates. And prior to that, there are big cells, but no animals. And then prior to that, there are little cells. But then prior to that, there's about 1 billion years where there is no life on Earth. So, this will come up by the end. It's 3.5 billion years ago that you have the first definite cells, and maybe a little bit earlier than that, maybe 3.8 billion years ago, that there are chemical traces of life on Earth. So no fossils, which definitely show it, but chemical evidence of chemicals which are associated with living things and not with the non-living world. So somewhere in here, there is life on Earth, but prior to that, there are no fossils, nor is there any chemical evidence that there is anything that is alive. You can tell that the proteins, the chemicals of cell walls, etc., they're different than what occurs in the non-living world. So even if you don't have fossils, rocks which were made in the presence of living things are chemically different from the ones which are not. And for about 1 billion years, there is no evidence of life on Earth, which then begs the question, if there was no life on Earth for a long time, and then all of a sudden there is life on Earth, where did life come from? And now that we no longer hold this idea of spontaneous generation, this becomes a much bigger question, because then it seems life arose once and that all life has been derived from, those original living things. Where did they come from? How could life come from a non-living world? Well, certainly there is some degree of organization which can occur in the absence of life. I mean, we look at this. I mean, here's a complex pattern. I mean, it's beautiful. So the non-living world is capable of some degree of organization, some degree of complexity in the absence of life. But the question is, can that organization,
for most of human history, most people seem to have believed in the
is that degree of organization capable of producing the life that we see around us? Okay. Well, let's go way back, because obviously water is going to be important in this, since water is the most abundant molecule in living things. If you were to consider the universe as best we understand it, hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. Helium, which doesn't tend to react much with anything, comes second. Oxygen comes third. Carbon comes fourth. Living things are primarily made of three of these four. So once again, helium isn't very reactive. Living things are mostly, give or take 96%, hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And so the three most common elements in the universe, as far as we can tell, three of the four are then also the three most common elements in living things. Now, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, they can react with each other in the non-living universe and produce molecules which are important to life, such as water. All right. So water has three atoms in it. It's H2O. And as far as we can tell, it is the most abundant three-atom molecule in the universe. So the most abundant molecule in me, I am more water than anything else, is also the most abundant three-atom molecule in the universe. Given that, there is water which is, formed in ice, there are, comets, etc., that the early Earth would have had water. It had hydrogen and oxygen. And also then, as it was then bombarded with elements from outer space, and especially within an atmosphere in the early solar system, this would have happened to a much greater degree than today, that there would have been abundant water, such as in comets, reaching our planet. And then as materials in the mantle were reacting, water would have been formed. And so the early Earth would have had water and would have been constantly bombarded with new water in the form of icy comets coming from the primitive solar system. And so at some point, our molten planet would have cooled to the point that it would have allowed for liquid water. And actually, some of the earliest rocks which we have from our planet, so if you look at the rocks which are the oldest, they were apparently made in the presence of water, so in a primitive ocean. So we know that that oceans go back, to about 4 billion years ago, and we know the solar system is a bit older, 4.6 billion years, given the age of lunar rocks and meteorites, etc. But 4 billion years ago is about the oldest that we have rocks or parts of rocks like zircons on our planet. By 3.5 billion years ago, we definitely have cells, and maybe 3.8 billion years ago, there are signs of it. So if you were to look at the history of the world, we can split the Precambrian into eons, like the Hadean, the Archean, or the Archaeozoic, and the Proterozoic. And it would be in the Hadean that we would have definite evidence of oceans, and then shortly afterwards, definite evidence of life, with, say by 3.5 billion years ago, fossils of living things, but say by 3.8 billion years ago, possible chemical traces of life. And so it seems that life arose in the ocean, and that the oceans were the center of life on Earth for billions of years. We would not get to much terrestrial life until we get to the Phanerozoic era. So for most of life's history, life was confined to the oceans. Oceans are ancient, and shortly after the first oceans, then we have living things. So once again, how does that happen? Well, the ancient oceans, they would have had this just abundance of minerals, even more so than today. And so minerals are dissolved in, can be dissolved in water. So I had, mentioned in fossilization that one type of fossilization called perimineralization involves the minerals dissolved in water slowly precipitating out. Well, if you were to say, go to this hot spring, which is resulting from geologic activity where there are minerals in the water coming from underneath the earth, from, which have been heated from geologic activity, you can actually see them, especially the ones with iron, because that will have flecks of red in them. And if you were to go to certain, hot springs, say out west in Colorado, you could see on the wall, like this is the mineral makeup of the water. So these early oceans certainly would have had an abundance of minerals, which can then undergo chemical reactions. All right, many of these chemical reactions occur spontaneously, even releasing heat in the process. So for example, there are lots of bacteria in the deep oceans today that live on this. So when minerals come out of the deep sea vents, if these bacteria can coax these minerals in their reduced form to undergo chemical reactions, that energy is actually released, and bacteria can live on this and use this as a source of energy. All right, so the non-living world can undergo chemical reactions spontaneously. There's an abundance of these different chemical elements. But then the most important question then boils down to biomolecules, organic molecules, because living things are composed of organic molecules which have carbon. All right, and so if you were to look, say, here at glucose, it is an organic molecule. It is a molecule of living things. And notice the black carbon atoms. Carbon is pretty unique in the periodic table. Now, some of the things underneath carbon, like silicon, could arguably do the same. But oxygen is rather boring. I mean, if you put two oxygens together, you get oxygen gas. You add a third, you get ozone. And that's about all you can do with oxygen by itself. If you add two chlorines together, you can get chlorine gas, but you want to add another, you find out you can't. Chlorine is pretty boring. But carbon, you can just keep adding and adding, making these, complex structures. And so molecules based on carbon are what we call organic molecules. Things like sugars, lipids, fatty acids, DNA and RNA. They're called organic molecules or biomolecules because it was originally thought that they are only found in living things, that only living things can produce these. We now know that that's not true. That if you were to take just molecules that you could find in the non-living world, like methane or water or carbon dioxide, and just add energy. And the world is full of energy. There's heat coming from geologic activity. There's ultraviolet light and cosmic rays coming from the sun. There's lightning. There is the impact of meteorites hitting a planet. There's all these sources of energy that if you just add energy, then you can get biomolecules without life. So if you have molecules of ammonia, which occurs in nature, then you can then get amino acids without life. You can get fatty acids without life. So even though we associate biomolecules or organic molecules with life, it was once thought that they only occur in the presence of living things. We now know that the non-living world can produce all of these organic molecules, amino acids, the components of proteins, fatty acids, sugars, and nucleotides. In fact, we know that there are 0 molecules in living things. So in my body, there are 0 molecules which absolutely require life to make these molecules. All the biomolecules of living things can be made in the absence of life with molecules that you find in the non-living world and a bit of energy. So for example, in this little activity that my students have access to, I ask if you were to take things like carbon dioxide and water and add some energy, what happens? Do you take these molecules and break them into individual atoms? Or can you make this sugar glucose? And it turns out glucose, which is a molecule which is essential for living things, can then be made without living things just by taking the molecules of the non-living world and adding some energy. The same is true of other sugars like galactose and fructose. So all of the sugars of living things can be made in the absence of living things. If you were to then take molecules from the non-living world, water, methane, etc., and add energy, you would then have fatty acids, which are essential for living things, making membranes and the like. If you were to add some ammonia to the mix, which has nitrogen, then you would make, among other things, amino acids. Now, glycine is a simple amino acid, the simplest, but you could actually get all of the amino acids found in living things, such as alanine, arginine, etc. So living things are essentially based on 20, give or take, amino acids, and you actually make far more than 20. So you make all 20 of the ones that living things utilize. And so notice that proteins are associated with living things. Proteins are made of amino acids. All of the amino acids can be made in the absence of life, simply using molecules that you would find in the non-living world and a little energy. So there are some amino acids which have sulfur, and sulfur is one of those minerals that can be present in water and then also included in these amino acids. Now, that last slide was referring to something called formamide, which I will get to in the next video after this one. So the big point is, how did life arise? Well, I'm building up to that, and the conclusion, if you want a spoiler, is I don't know. All right, I don't know how life arose, because if I were to say that I know from a scientific sense, I mean, lots of people have opinions. So I feel strongly about this, or I feel strongly about that. Fine, I mean, everyone's welcome to opinions. But if you were to say scientifically, how would I know? Well, you could have a time machine and go back and test it, and we can't do that. You could have, genetic evidence, but genetic evidence, you need living things. And so, the world before living things, how, might, the first cells have evolved. I mean, we don't have genetic molecules from preserved in rock, nor are those things still alive. So genetics can't help us. Embryology obviously can help us. Can fossils? Well, as I'll get to presently, there may actually be fossils of pre-cells known from, say, rocks in Greenland, which are 3.8 billion years ago. They had carbon. They seem to have they had membranes. They were budding. So these could actually be the ancestors of all life on Earth. Or they could be complex bubbles, because complex bubbles form too. So they could be irrelevant to this discussion of the origin of life. So even if you had the fossils that you were looking for, you wouldn't know, you couldn't distinguish between these and just complex bubbles. So the answer at the end will have to be from scientific point. I don't know. I can't say, how life arose, simply because the evidence is difficult to gather. All right. But then the question could come up, well, then are we just being silly if we're going to, get to the point where I don't know? The answer is no. Because as we go through this process and ask, well, might this have happened? How likely is this? Is this a possible set of chemical reactions, et cetera? We learn a lot. As I'll get to presently, this pursuit of how might life have arisen, it's, resulted in Nobel Prize winning work. It's changed how we view human cells. It's opened up this big field of biotechnology. So this has greatly enhanced how we understand living things, even to the point where it's affecting how we look at cancer, how biotechnology creates new molecules. So understanding the natural world has great value. So asking questions and answering them, even if we will never ultimately say, we have enormous confidence that 3.8 billion years ago that these are the chemical reactions that occurred out on our planet. Nevertheless, we learn a great deal along the way. We can come back to that at the end. So once again, the molecules which we once called organic molecules, they can, I'm sorry, I'll get back to that. They can arise in the absence of life. Now, obviously, at some point, we'd like to talk about DNA and RNA. So it's perhaps then of interest that if you were to take water, which is the most abundant molecule in the universe that has 3 atoms, and if you were to take this molecule, which is a hydrogen, a carbon, and a nitrogen, hydrogen cyanide, which is the most common a 3 atom molecule that has carbon in it. So the universe has more of this than any other molecule that has carbon in it. The universe has more of this than any other 3 carbon molecule. If you allow these to react, you get something known as formamide. All right, so formamide looks like this. So the universe would form this naturally, given that the 2 reactants are not uncommon in the universe. And formamide can then be the basis, the precursor to all of the nucleotides in DNA, RNA, diverse carboxylic acids, and more. All right, and so once again, all of the molecules which make up me or any other living thing, all of them can originate abiotically in the absence of life. Even things like DNA and RNA nucleotides, they're composed of sugars, and sugars like ribose, deoxyribose can occur in the absence of life, and then they include those nitrogenous bases. And so, while I do not know how life arose in a scientific sense, I can't say I know this. The Earth was covered by oceans before life appeared, and we know that in the absence of life, biomolecules form, sugars, fatty acids, amino acids. So the early oceans would have been accumulating sugar, amino acids, fatty acids, nucleotides, and the like. Now, in the modern world, these molecules don't last all that long for 2 reasons. 1, they can react with oxygen and be degraded. 2, bacteria can use them for food. All right, so between bacteria and the oxygen in the air, these molecules have a limited lifespan in the modern world. But if one were to think, well, the early Earth didn't have much oxygen. We can get to that later. We know it didn't have much oxygen because nothing rusted. You would have a lot of oxidized iron and other metals from the first half of Earth's history if there was a lot of oxygen in the air, and there simply isn't. Metals tend to form minerals in a reduced form, which only form when oxygen isn't readily available. So oxygen simply wasn't around. The rocks show that. And if we're talking about the period before life on Earth, then there weren't bacteria. So once you make sugars and amino acids and fatty acids, they're not going anywhere because the things that would make them disappear simply aren't present. And so The term that is often used is primordial soup. The oceans of the world would have accumulated sugars and fatty acids and amino acids and nucleotides, and would have become like a weak broth, if you will, simply because these organic molecules wouldn't have gone anywhere. Probably would have smelled a great deal as well, just because without much oxygen, instead of making, carbon dioxide, nitrate, sulfate, you would have made things like methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia, things that have, more of an odor. So the early Earth, probably formed, a type of, primordial soup, if you will. Now, that's fascinating. But if you notice here, something that also happens in the absence of life is that little molecules can then coalesce, react, and form bigger molecules. So fatty acids can react with 3 carbon molecules like glycerol and produce fats and oils. Amino acids can come together and form short chains. And sugars can, these sugar units called monosaccharides can join together and form short chains. That's easily demonstrated. If you simply then have simple organic molecules and then mix them, maybe add a little energy, then you'll get chains. You'll get short protein chains, short DNA or RNA chains if the nucleotides are present, short chains of sugars, etc. So not only do all of the biomolecules form in the absence of life, you then also get chains of biomolecules forming from their simple building blocks, their monomers, in the absence of life. All right. So we know that that would have been happening just because, it just so readily happens. If you mix, these organic molecules in, actually, I'm sorry, let me finish this video before going to the slide. Now, one of the reasons that this is significant is, let's say you start to form, lipids like, triglycerides, fats, oils, and, maybe even short proteins, etc. Well, because lipids are nonpolar and because water is polar, once you mix them, the lipids tend to form bubbles. They tend to form these balls, which we could call lots of things. We could call them coacervates. We could call them microspheres if you wanted. But you mix, oils and water, and you get, bubbles. So this happens, readily. So this certainly would have happened in a primordial soup, and we can simulate experiments, as I'll get to in just a second, where this happens, under experimental conditions. Now, once you have these situations, if you keep adding lipid, well, then some of these lipid bubbles will grow and then split in two. Now, it almost looks as if cells are dividing, but they're not cells. They're not alive. They're just bubbles. But they can grow and bud and kind of split in the absence of life. So you can get things that look like bubbles wrapped in lipids, kind of like cell membranes. And these can, bubble, these can grow and split on their own, kind of looking like cell division. It's not, these are not alive. But this is all stuff which happens readily in the absence of life. Because this is non-polar, or, from the polar water, that other biomolecules, which can have non-polar regions, they can accumulate inside. And so if in this original broth, in addition to fats, you had short proteins or short RNA molecules, that they can end up on the inside of this when the bubbles form. And if any of these catalyze chemical reactions, which they can, and I'll get to, then what you have is a bubble with short RNA molecules, short proteins inside, which can actually be catalyzing chemical reactions, all in the absence of life. Now, just let me kind of catch up with this. What I've been saying is kind of, just a summary of what was discovered in the famous Miller-Urey experiment, where they imagine what do we think was present in the early Earth's atmosphere. So if we simply put those elements together, and add energy, then they found we get all of the biomolecules of living things. And similar reactions continue to occur, deep in the ocean at hydrothermal sea vents, etc. So not only, can be demonstrated in the lab, it's still occurring in the world. It's also occurring in other outside Earth. I mean, when you analyze meteorites, as I'll get to, you can get organic molecules. You can get sugars, fats, amino acids, which were generated by abiotic reactions in space. You can get these to form these bubbles, which look like little cells with cell membranes, but they're, whether we want to call them coacervates or microspheres, you can find them in rocks, where you can call them nanobes if you like. And then you can get them from extraterrestrial sources. So here's a meteorite, all right, which fell in 1969. But if you take a sample from that meteorite and add water, not only do you find organic molecules once thought to be part of the only the living world, but they will form bubbles with little membranes made of extraterrestrial organic molecules. Now, I'd like to just step back and make a statement. In the early 1900s, there was this idea of organic molecules could only occur with some vital force. There were people who called themselves vitalists. They felt that there was something mystical or spiritual about, say, how the brain worked or how the heart worked, that you couldn't explain it all just with a lab or just with biology or with data, because there's just thought or the beating of a heart or the digestion of food or fetal development. It just involved a mystical vital force, and that you could never describe this process fully without this mystical vital force. We now know that vitalism was wrong. You can describe thought or the beating of a heart or the digestion of food or fetal development just by talking about natural processes. There's no mystical force which is the missing element, explaining this. In the same way, it was felt that organic molecules had this mystical vital force, that there was a difference between things like salt and carbon dioxide and ammonia, the things you found in the non-living world, plus, then sugars and fats and proteins and the molecules of the living world. It was thought that these had this vital force, that you could never understand these just in a lab. All right, because there was more than just the non-living components. You had to add this mystical vital force. So they called themselves the vitalists. And we now understand that that was wrong. All right, there's nothing mystical in these organic molecules of sugars and amino acids and RNAs, et cetera, because you can even take molecules from space, from meteorites. Not only are there organic molecules, but they will form, membrane-like balls. Here. And so, once again, I don't know how life arose, and the end of this discussion is not going to be life arose this way. It's just not. But these observations are certainly potentially relevant. The fact that every molecule of living things can arise in the non-living world, that small monomers can form chains, polymers in the absence of life. Then you can then get membrane-like structures forming in the absence of life. These membranes can actually even swell and split on their own. They can include things like proteins and RNAs inside in the absence of life. Chemical reactions can be catalyzed by these biomolecules inside in the absence of life. So once again, these most likely were relevant to a discussion of the origin of life. But then here we come to the big question mark. How do you go from bubbles with polymers, with some chemical reactions? How do you then go to a protocell that we would call alive, or certainly on its way to life? Well, then this then gets us to the concept of an RNA world. Modern cells are complex, and obviously teaching genetics, I have lots of videos on these, but just to sum up, in a modern cell, say DNA in the nucleus, then is copied to make RNA, and then the RNA then catalyzes the production of protein. All right, so that's what happens in the modern world. But obviously that's complicated. All right, so the first cells could not have done that, because to do that you would need DNA, and you would need RNA, and you would need protein. So you'd need to have mechanisms involving 3 complex biomolecules, all simultaneous. And so it is now, that did not occur in that way. So the protocells were not modern cells. So if you look at what happens in a modern cell, it has DNA, and then, it has DNA, which makes RNA, which makes protein. And if you ask like the first protocells, the origin of life, they, those things could not have had that level of complexity. But then, is there anything simpler which is possible? Well, the answer is RNA cannot just in modern cells be the intermediary. RNA could be its own genetic code. I mean, some viruses use RNA as a genetic code. It's not as good as DNA, because its mutation can change it more readily. But RNA is capable of being its own genetic code. And RNA, we now understand, and I'll elaborate on it a little bit, RNA can do pretty much everything that proteins can do, not as well, all right? It can form 3-dimensional shapes, not as well. It doesn't hold its shapes as well as proteins does. The variable side chains, which we find in diverse amino acids, you can modify the 4 RNA nucleotides and add additional things and give, approaching that, diversity, just not as well. So RNA can do what DNA does, but just not as well. RNA can do what protein does, but just not as well. And so then the idea is these protocells could potentially have lived in what's called an RNA world, where there wasn't DNA yet, there wasn't protein yet, that RNA was used for everything. So while modern cells are more complex, using DNA to encode RNA, which guides the development of protein, that the first protocells might have gotten by with just one of the 3, RNA. Not as well, right? But nevertheless, if we're asking how did life begin, the first living things, the precursors to living things, would have been simpler than the modern living things, even modern bacteria, which have had 3.5 billion years to play around with stuff. And so in the 1960s, with this idea of an RNA world, people began to look at RNA more closely. And we now know a lot more about them. And just as I talk about this, this sounds a little weird, but I'm older. I remember when, taking biology classes, DNA, that's the big molecule that codes for information. Protein, that runs the cell. RNA is just kind of the thing in between. I mean, that's how I learned it. Of the 3, all right, RNA, it's just kind of the go-between. DNA is really important, protein is really important. RNA, it's the lesser of the 3. We have changed that view. And so once again, because I've seen that change in my lifetime, and I remember how we used to consider these things, this is more significant to me. So if I sound a little more excited than you are, perhaps that's, perhaps the reason. We now know that RNA is far more complex than we thought it was. So first off, RNA, I always just picture it, it's this little, chain of nucleotides. But obviously, nucleotides can be complementary and they can interact. So RNA forms 3-dimensional shapes. That is so important. We had no idea how important the 3-dimensional shapes of RNA were today in modern cells. So if you want to understand modern cells, that's critical. But now going back to protocells, once again, because RNA can fold in all of these different ways, it can now do things which we used to just associate with protein. Protein can take these shapes, and the protein shape is important in its function. But RNA is capable of so much more in the way of complex structures than we knew. Okay. Because it has so much because it can have so many complex features to it, it's actually capable of catalyzing chemical reactions. Now, if your reaction is kind of blasé when I say RNA can catalyze chemical reactions. It's perhaps because you live in the modern world, and we know that. But this was, shattering to how we understand life, modern cells, etc. It was Nobel Prize winning work. And so the idea that it's not just proteins which form enzymes, which can catalyze chemical reactions, but that RNA can form ribozymes, which can catalyze chemical reactions. That's an amazing breakthrough. So it was recognized as being an amazing breakthrough with Nobel Prize winning work. And so once again, I'm going to try to limit myself because this is just so exciting if you were to say study genetics. But once again, this came from the study of the origin of life. Even if at the end of this, we don't say life, originated this way, we absolutely know this. The stuff we learn along the way through the experiments, through the analyses, through testing of hypotheses, we learn stuff. And it turns out we learn stuff which fundamentally enhances how we understand modern cells, including our own. So right now there's, cancer treatments and biotechnology and, thousands and thousands of scientific papers being published, resulting to a large degree from this work, which stemmed to a large degree from the consideration of the role of RNA in the origin of life. If there was an RNA world, then RNA must be capable of much more than we thought. What is it capable of? So, once again, this is how science operates, and the study of the origin of life has already made just incredible contributions to our understanding. So once again, I'm going to try to make this quick because, my students in this class, this is for non-majors. If I were to speak, teach my genetics class, this much more involved. So just very, very quick. We now know that RNA has so many more complex shapes that we know of. And it can catalyze chemical reactions. So for example, if you were to take the ribosome, which is arguably one of the central parts of the cell, because this is where proteins are made. Ribosomes are made of made of proteins, about half their weight, and made of RNA. And if you look at the RNA, you've got these big molecules that have incredibly complex shapes. Now, when I was in school, it was known that a ribosome is about half RNA and about half protein. And it was always just assumed that it was the RNA, my fault, it's the protein, which was the important part. Because when I was in school, proteins did chemical reactions. Proteins were the doers of the cell. So who knows what the RNA is doing there. But whatever the protein half is doing, that's the important part. That's wrong. The RNA is doing the important part. So when you take two amino acids and you stick them together to make a protein, it is the blue stuff, the RNA, which is doing that. So in what's a central, one of the most important parts of the cell, RNA is doing this. RNA is building proteins by catalyzing a chemical reaction, something that we didn't think RNA could do until relatively recently. We now know that RNA is capable of either splicing itself or forming a spliceosome, which edits genes. So when you copy a gene, it's got pink regions and green regions, introns and exons. And it's RNA, which is responsible for saying, where is the meaning? Where's the important part here? What parts do we cut out? What parts do we paste together to make the copy of the gene, which then makes the protein? RNA is editing the genetic content to determine what has meaning. And there are just so many examples of things that RNA does. And once again, if I were teaching a genetics class, we would be talking about, RNA and its roles for an hour. This is, meant for a more generalized message. And so I won't go into to that, but suffice it to say that we now have this, greatly enhanced idea of what RNA does. First of all, DNA is made from RNA. So how do you make thymine, the DNA nucleotide, or adenine, the DNA nucleotide? You first start off with thymine or adenine. I thought that was a horrible example. You first, let's go do adenine, thymine, sorry. If you wanted to make cytosine or adenine, you start off with cytosine or adenine, the RNA nucleotide that then gets converted to the DNA nucleotide. So one of the, here's a reason, to see how critical RNA is. DNA is made from RNA. ATP, which is our energy source for our bodies, that's an RNA nucleotide. So essentially all of the energy that your cells have ever used, whether to have muscles contract or to pump ions or to move chromosomes or to make new DNA, all of that has come from ATP, which is an RNA nucleotide with a couple extra phosphates on it. So RNA has powered your life. RNA nucleotides have. Here, RNA molecules splice out introns and then add these more important exons together to make a message. We now understand so much more about life than we once did, and a lot of this has come from this origin of life scenario. So, I go into this a little bit more. I have videos where there's an RNA song where RNA molecules are talking about the things that they do in the cell. So if you'd like to, to kind of, listen to that, fine. But the big picture is the question mark in the origin of life is how you go from, membranous balls with, polymers in it, which are easy to form. There's no question that the primitive Earth got to this point. How do you bridge that gap to go to the first cells? And we don't know. We weren't there, and that those things didn't leave signs that we can study scientifically. Even if life could be created in a test tube tomorrow, that isn't proof of what happened 3.8 billion years on the planet. So we can ask these questions, but we may never get to the point I definitely know the answer. But that being said, RNA, which we think was the major molecule in primitive cells, we now know it is so much more important and central to life than we once understood. DNA is made from it. All energy transactions in cells involve the RNA nucleotide ATP, or to a lesser degree, things like GTP, CTP, and UTP, which are also then RNA nucleotides. And the RNA molecules are capable of being so much bigger than we thought, so much more complex in their three-dimensional shape than we thought, and actually capable of catalyzing chemical reactions, something that we didn't know. When we look at what is central to the cell, things like the ribosome, which makes protein, or the spliceosome, which edits the genome, it's RNA molecules and protein together. But interestingly, the little proteins, they are not the doers. They are not the ones which are doing the work. They are helping the RNA keep its shape. The RNA is doing the work. And so we have learned so much about how our cells, work based on this. But once again, that kind of, goes into more genetic analyses. We think that there were protocells where RNA were the major molecule, and thus these protocells lived in, quote, an RNA world. And RNA was working as the genetic molecule. DNA was added later because there are advantages to using DNA. It doesn't mutate as frequently. So DNA was added later. Protein was added later. First, little proteins which help the RNA keep its shape, and then later, protein then became more of the doer of the cell, catalyzing chemical reactions, and RNA less, although RNA still does more than we thought it would. Now, many people would say, oh, well, this is ridiculous, because what are the odds of that? And they'll come up and they'll say, what are the odds of getting a protein with all of these amino acids in all the correct order? The odds are like 1 in a gazillion, something. They're essentially 0. This is impossible. Okay. Well, those arguments are deceptive, and sometimes deliberately deceptive, on multiple counts, which I go to in this video. And so if you'd like to listen to all of the varied ways, by all means you can. But here's the major point. If you were to say life could not have arisen because the odds are just so improbable, it's 1 in something, 1 in the suit, it's this tiny number, fine. But remember that the Earth is an enormous place. The oceans are enormous. The subsurface rocks are enormous. So here, what are your odds of getting a 6? Well, if you roll 1 dice, it's 1 in 6. If you roll a bunch of dice, if you roll 6 dice, the odds are, statistically, you will get a 6 each and every time on average. So the more dice you're rolling, the higher the odds you are at success. So the odds of getting a 6 are not 1 in 6. If you're rolling 6 dice, they're essentially 1. And so then the question then comes, what are the odds that life would arise? Well, if you were to roll the dice once, this is improbable. All right. So if you're going to say, oh, here's a molecule that you would need, what are the odds that all of the pieces come together in precisely that order? Well, the odds are very small. And so you can say, oh, it's 0. Fine. But how many times does a planet get to roll the dice? So if you were asked, like, here at this one moment in this one spot, what are the odds that this would happen? Well, close to 0, essentially 0. But remember that the planet is huge, that if this is occurring over hundreds of millions of years, there's lots of chances. It's like rolling a gazillion dice. So what are the odds that this happens in one place at one moment? It's a very small number. But then how many times does a planet get to try? Well, that's a really big number. And if you're calculating odds, you multiply the odds of, what are your odds of rolling a 6? 1 in 6, that's a small number. But if you roll 6 dice, that's a big number. You multiply the two together and you get a 1. It's likely to happen. And the same thing here. What are the odds that all of these chemical reactions would occur? It's a really small likelihood. How many times does a planet get to try? A really big number. Plus, there's all of these other things I go into here. So, for example, if you have clay can actually, in its repeating pockets, hold lots of pieces together. So it's not the odds that they would bump into each other by random. You can, get, them here. You don't have to come up with this specific sequence, because you could come up with a sequence which could then mutate and get better over time. And so you could end up, so there's all of these other considerations. But the big point is, over hundreds of millions of years, our planet had a primordial soup with all of the building blocks of life performing chemical reactions. And you don't have to have all of the genetic components of a modern cell to get function. RNA molecules without DNA and protein can do stuff, all right? And we're still learning to appreciate how much. So it is then the model, which will never be completely testable because we don't have a time machine to go back in time, nor do we have the any remnants of that early world. It is in that model that somewhere there were these non-living bubbles which then approached a threshold of what we would call alive. There are fossils from Isua, Greenland, 3.8 billion years ago, which are carbon-rich bubbles which seem to be budding and splitting. These could actually be proto-cells. But then again, they might not. They might just be complex bubbles. But nevertheless, we think the world was full of these. So at some point, 3.5 billion years ago, there are these, okay? This is not a bubble. This is not a guess, a hypothesis. This is a fossil of something that actually lived. It's a fossil of cells, but the simplest cells, the bacteria, similar to those alive today. So it is fascinating to ask the question, how might life have arisen? What was the origin of life? But at the end, I mean, in science, we never say we know anything 100%. I mean, because everything is open to doubting and question. And we certainly will never know the answer to this question. It's worth asking because along the way, we learn exciting things. When I teach genetics, genetics is fundamentally different now that we understand the roles of RNA. There's so many things it's doing in modern cells we just didn't know. And that, to a large part, extend from origin of life analyses, thinking that if RNA was once, the central molecule, how complex can it get? So all of this is fascinating. But after a certain point, we want to leave the question of what might have happened and ask the question, well, what did happen? And from 3.5 billion years ago, there are actual fossils of living things. So we can now ask, about those fossils, what did happen when life first arose? And that then is the topic of the next video.